welcome all of those who sadly we can't see on the screen, and thank you for joining us again for this, the third in our series on exploring memorials. We've had two fantastic talks, and I'm in no doubt that tonight's will knock the socks off the rest and continue us in this fine form. Housekeeping first. As you will have heard when you were joining, this has been recorded and will therefore be able to be shared with those who bought tickets, and in due course hopefully will be up on the members part of the website. Please put your Q&A in the box at the bottom, and I will try and feed them into the conversation at the end of the talk, and you will find details of the other lectures that are coming up on the website, and I will add a link in due course to the chat, but we won't be distracted from tonight, where we are lucky to be able to focus on the work of really one of the most foremost architects of his generation, of a generation, as we explore these ideas behind memorials and their evolution. We have the opportunity tonight to be taken on a journey through Sir Herbert Baker's work, through the British Empire, in Europe and at home, and of course his work is almost certainly well known to many of us here on this talk, but probably not as well as our two speakers this evening. John Stewart, an architect, historian, writer of at least 5 books, and indeed, all being well, a full biography on Sir Herbert Baker should be published, all being well, in November. Keep an eye out. Apparently another book to follow soon after. And also Michael Baker, Sir Herbert's grandson, who really, I suppose, has therefore lived and breathed it all his life, but has demonstrated his lifelong interest in much of the research he's done. So really, I think I should probably now hand over to you both, and we'll reappear at the end. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Robbie. If I can just start with a slight technical point. Most of the illustrations are on the right-hand side of the screen, so if you'd like to move the images of the speakers over to the left, that'll probably work better and save you having the images obscured as we work our way through. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about the work of Sir Herbert Baker, one of the most prominent architects of the first part of the 20th century, the architect of really a prolific architect with buildings throughout the British Empire, from South Africa, where he built the Cape Town Cathedral, the Union buildings, through to New Delhi, where he worked with Lutyens, as many people will know. Baker being responsible for the Indian government building, the Parliament building, and also the secretariats there. And then I had a very extensive London practice, which included the rebuilding of the Bank of England, India House, South Africa House, Rhodes House, Church House, and many other buildings in the United Kingdom. He worked with Lutyens on a number of occasions, most significantly in India, but they first met in the late 1880s in the office of Ernest George, where Baker was the senior assistant, and he was joined by the 18-year-old Edwin Lutyens, who was 7 years his junior. They're very different characters. Baker, serious, much more experienced young architect than Lutyens, who even then was well known to come out with his witty quips. But despite their differences and the age gap, they became very good friends and spent a lot of time together from that period forward, and continued their correspondence when Baker was in South Africa. Lutyens was the first to leave Ernest George when he won the commission for Crooksbury, and he set up his own practice about 18 months after he joined Ernest George, and Baker left about a year after Lutyens, setting up his own practice in Gravesend in Kent. And he worked there for about 18 months until his younger brother Lionel returned from South Africa with tales of the extraordinary money that could be made in fruit farming in South Africa. And their father decided to invest in Lionel's idea and sold most of the family estate in Kent to fund it. And as it was such a significant investment for the family, asked Herbert if he would go out to South Africa with his younger brother. to oversee the investment and the setting up of the fruit farming arrangements. And so in 1892, the young brothers arrived in Cape Town, and 2 or 3 weeks after their arrival, Herbert found himself sitting opposite Cecil Rhodes at a dinner. And he was hugely embarrassed because he spent the entire evening without being able to enter into any form of conversation with this giant of African politics and business. But Rhodes later inquired as to who the quiet young man was from England, and being just about to set about the restoration of his house, Crouture, in Cape Town, he invited Herbert Baker to carry out the work. And that relationship of architect and client soon developed into one of friendship. And indeed, Baker moved to a house near the edge of the Crouture estate. And the two men spent increasing amounts of time together. Baker was fascinated by this line of empire, while Rhodes was actually very interested in both Baker's architecture, but also his knowledge of literature and poetry. And so they developed a relationship and spent a lot of time together when Rhodes was at home in Cape Town. With the outbreak of the Second Boer War, Rhodes went to Kimberley to make sure that his diamond mines didn't fall into the hands of the Boers, and was in fact holed up there throughout the siege of Kimberley. And while he was there, he decided that he was going to build a number of monuments to commemorate the actions of the British in South Africa. And so when he returned to Cape Town, he placed a note on the drawing board of Herbert Baker, which read, "I desire you to see Rome, Paestum, Agrigentum, Thebes, and Athens. I'm thinking of erecting a mausoleum to those who fell at Kimberley, a bath, and a copy of Paestum. Your expenses will be paid, and in case I undertake any of these thoughts, you will receive the usual architect's fee of 5%, C.J. Rhodes." So Sir Herbert, or Herbert as he was then, suddenly found himself off on a European tour at Rhodes' expense. And when he returned, it gave them both the opportunity to discuss the memorial designs in detail with reference to what they had both seen. And the first of these memorials was the Shangani Memorial, which was to the 34 members of the Shangani Patrol of British soldiers who were massacred by the Matabele warriors, who were in reality simply defending their lands. But nevertheless, the Shangani Patrol became heroes of the empire, and Rhodes paid for this monument to be erected to them. And in the monuments that Baker completed with Rhodes, they spent a considerable amount of time discussing them themselves, with Baker producing sketches and the two discussing them. And this one is, in fact, is based on the pedestal of Agrippa from the Acropolis. But the important thing, I think, in terms of the monuments which Baker designed and his contemporaries is the severity and restraint of this monument. It really is one of the first examples of the elemental classicism that Lutyens would go on to master, and probably Charles Holden would take to its extreme. Very, very simple. A simple block with entasis, and the cornice over protecting the bronze sculptures by John Tweed, which show the history of the Shangani Patrol. It's particularly Spartan. I think it reflects the two men's masculinity, and still stands next to Rhodes' tomb in South Africa. The next monument is the one to the fallen of Kimberley, who lost their lives during the siege. And in terms of Herbert Baker's architecture, it's an incredibly important monument. It was really a symbol of both of empire for Rhodes and Baker. And the colonnade is raised above ground level, and from there, in this instance, you can look out in all directions across the whole of the African continent, which of course Rhodes wished to conquer and bring under British rule. but it symbolizes what Rhodes saw as the long vision, the big idea, rather than the day-to-day. And that idea of having taking the long-term view, having vision, really is encapsulated within this very stark but very beautiful monument. And we see this element, the colonnade, returning again and again in Baker's work throughout the rest of his career. The final one of the Rhodes Memorials is the one to Rhodes himself. And Baker was actually out of the country when Rhodes died, but on his return, he suggested this site, which was where Rhodes often sat on the hillside above his estate, looking north over the African continent. And it again repeats the idea here with the two colonnades either side of the long view. And in fact, as you ascend to the monument, to this bronze of Rhodes in the center, one makes the progression towards that. But the more important thing is as you turn around then and share Rhodes's view of the land that lay before him, which he had hoped to conquer. It was originally going to be quite a simple monument, but with the death of Alfred Beat, one of Rhodes's colleagues, he left a substantial sum, which allowed them to include the statues of energy by Watt, and also the swans, lions, which Herbert Baker commissioned. By 1912, Baker was nearing completion of the Union buildings, as we see here in Pretoria, which were the new government buildings for the combined government of South Africa. We can actually see the colonnades here again, which led off some of the ministers' rooms, encouraging them also to take this long view. And it was really the completion of the Union buildings and his friendship with Lutyens which led to them both being appointed as equal partners to advise the government of India on architectural matters and to carry out the design of the principal buildings in what became New Delhi. And so at this time, Baker moved to London and established a new practice there. And really with Baker and Lutyens' appointment for New Delhi, they became the premier architects of their generation, and were joined with Sir Reginald Blomfield, who was a past president of the RIBA, as the three architects who were selected by the Imperial War Graves Commission, as it was then called, to undertake the design of the cemeteries in France to the fallen of the First World War. And so the three architects traveled to France in 1917 with the members of the Imperial War Graves Commission, and it was in these visits and in the subsequent discussions that the pattern of the cemeteries was developed, with Lutyens' War Stone, Blomfield's Cross of Sacrifice that we can see here on the right, and Baker's contribution, or one of Baker's contributions, was to propose that there should be shelters on all of the cemeteries wherever possible. And this came from an experience he'd had with his wife when they were in France, and they came across the mother of a soldier who'd come to visit her son's grave and was standing there in pouring rain. And so Baker suggested that even the most modest form of shelter should be provided wherever possible. This is actually Norfolk Cemetery in France on the Somme, which is typical of all the cemeteries, but of Baker's in particular. Very simple, no hint of triumph, very much really focusing on trying to provide a place of peace where visitors could visit the graves of their lost ones. And he said himself that his aim was really the simple English churchyard. The association with English traditional burial places, I felt, should be a prevailing factor in the designs for the shrines of the dead. And certainly in his smaller cemeteries, that feeling of peace and tranquility was very much felt. Unfortunately, many of the cemeteries were considerably larger than Norfolk. And this is actually the entrance to Tyne Cot, where there are almost 12,000 members of the Allied Armed Forces buried. But it's a good example too of Baker's style in the cemeteries. We saw in Norfolk the use of a local brick, but here he uses flint, which is one of his favorite materials. I mean, I think it means two things for Baker. I think in this instance, he sees its extraordinary durability almost as a symbol of eternal life. But also, I think he regards it as symptomatic of the hardy English spirit as he saw it. And it's a memory of his childhood in Kent and the churchyard walls there that he brought to France and used again and again in his work. Unfortunately, when you see the scale of Tyne Cot, any feeling of replicating an English churchyard is sadly long gone. And in addition to the 12,000 graves which are there, which mark the graves of known soldiers, it also acts as a memorial to those that were missing, because of the million Allied troops who lost their lives, 500,000 were never found. And so in addition to the design of the cemeteries, all of the War Grave Commission architects designed a number of memorials. And here the semicircular wall around the base of the cemetery with the two pavilions either side is used to show the names of those who have lost their lives with no known grave. And just as Lutyens struggled with to accommodate the incredible number of names at Thiepval, so Baker had to add the two rings on either side and the semicircular apse in the centre, simply to provide more space for the extraordinary number of names of the fallen. He was also invited to carry out a number of other memorials to the missing, and this is actually at Delville Wood. This was the memorial to the South African soldiers who came to the call of the motherland to fight with the other allies against the Germans in the First World War. And it was a scene of particular heroism of the South African patrol. They'd actually been, the wood had been captured by the Scots 9th Division, who then retreated, but passed it over to the South African Brigade to hold against the German forces, who then mounted a sustained attack on this South African force, who held out for 4 days before their ammunition and water ran out. So it was selected as the site of the memorial, and it's one of the very few memorials that Baker designed in the First World War that has any feeling of triumph rather than peace. But he felt such was the heroism exhibited that it merited that approach on this occasion. And so we have the triumphal arch with the dome on top, and then above that, Castor and Pollux reining in the horse. A bronze which was then replicated and reproduced and mounted in front of the Union buildings in South Africa, with the two boys representing the two races of South Africa, not white and black, but Dutch and English, as the things were seen in those days. And then to the rear is a museum outlining the events that took place and the history of the South African Brigade, which replaced Blomfield's Cross of Sacrifice, which was originally there. He was also asked to carry out the monument to the Indian fallen at Neuve Chapelle. It actually fell into Reginald Blomfield's zone, but with Baker's knowledge of Indian architecture and love of Indian architecture that had developed during his work in Delhi, he was asked to carry it out. And I think it's actually the finest of all his memorials. It's a very simple circular plan with a pierced screen to the left and a solid screen with the names to the right. And one enters from the side of the pierced screen with Lutyens Stone of Remembrance in the centre, and then goes to right or left, and then to the side of the memorial, entering through these beautiful Indian chatteries. It's just this very simple, very peaceful, one material, Portland stone, and beautifully executed. The other group of memorials that Herbert Baker was involved in were the memorials to the fallen former pupils of Britain's public and private schools. Most of the private schools had corps, and so their former pupils had some degree of military training, and they were generally regarded as the kind of gentlemen who would be given commissions in the army. The bad news was that if you were a commissioned officer, it was expected that you led your troops over the top with not much more than a revolver and a whistle. And so the level of the number of deaths, the losses that the schools suffered amongst their former pupils really were quite horrific. And so Baker was responsible for memorials at Harrow that we can see here, Winchester, the designer one at Eton that wasn't actually carried out, and Haileybury, as well as a number of other school plaques and minor memorials. But as a memorial at Harrow is very interesting, a very, very difficult site. In fact, the English Heritage described his design as a masterful solution, because there's a 4-story drop in a change of level between the lane on the left that carries on rising up behind the building to the lower road that leads down the hill to the railway station in Harrow. And Baker not only slotted in the memorial building here, but used the opportunity to completely reorganize the main entrance to Harrow School. On the ground floor within the arches here, we have the memorial to the 644 Harrovians who were killed in the First World War, with a stone tomb to the left and the names around the walls. And then the building carries on in, rising up in a really delightful flight of steps to the next level, and serving speech hall behind by William Burgess. And then in front of the building, he's created a small space, and just to return to the previous slide, and on the other side of that, a double flight of steps, which provided a new entrance for Harrow School really for the very first time. It had been a very casually put together collection of buildings up until this intervention by Herbert Baker. And so to Winchester College Memorial, which was very important to Baker. He described his work on Winchester College Memorial as the happiest time in his career. He worked on it very closely with Monty Rendell, who was the headmaster then of the school, and the solution that he came up with was very close to his heart. But it was a memorial that had been in consideration for some considerable time. In fact, the first discussion that took place regarding memorial and the sort of fundraising took place in 1916 at the front amongst Wickhamists who were on active service. And indeed, 3 of the officers who were there at that first dinner actually had their names included in the memorial come the end of the war. Various options were considered: a new dining room, other facilities for the school, a straight monument as a memorial. And it was finally decided that they should provide a new cloister as part of the, within the school grounds as part of the school. And Baker cleverly located it so that it also acted as one of the main entrances to the school. So boys arriving from outside the grounds would pass through the cloister as they entered the school. And a tradition was established in that they would take off their hats in respect to those who had given their lives. And this was a theme through a lot of Baker's memorials that Michael, I think, will come on to this linking between those that are living and those that had lost their lives. It's typical Baker. It's surrounded on its outside by a defensive wall of flint, and then inside is this delightful combination of Portland stone arches and double Doric columns. Within the arcade are symbols and badges of all of the regiments that were that the former pupils served in, and there's considerable amount of sculpture and symbols of the empire throughout the cloister. I actually spent a delightful morning there with Michael Baker, who will be telling you a little bit more about Sir Herbert's home memorials, and who fortunately had a guidebook to the memorial, and we were able to go through all the symbols and work out all the regimental crests and the different areas of the empire that were represented. So if I can pass over to Michael, and he'll take you through the home memorials, which are another group of Sir Herbert's many contributions. Michael.
Thank you, John. I hope you can all hear me. And thank you for showing us Herbert's work and those overseas war graves. You gave me some new insights into his work. For example, I hadn't realized the connection between columns and vision. That's a nice idea. I hadn't known that until you spoke of it a moment or two ago. And yes, I agree with the comment. What a stunning photo that is of Tyne Cot from the air, looking, you've got the whole thing there, looks pristine in the early sunshine with nobody there, but the whole thing visible. Now, what I plan to do, if that's all right, is to turn to some more modest but important contributions to the memorials at home. And before the Armistice of November 1918, the War Grave Commission had established that all who had fallen should be buried in the places where they had died. But many at home found this hard. They'd lost their sons or brothers, but they had no place to mourn. So with this in mind, 6 weeks after the Armistice, a letter was given prominence in the Times under this heading, War Memorials, and it was penned by my grandfather. Let me quote a bit of this piece from the Times, January 9th, 1919. We at home, Herbert wrote, will realize it is a noble conception that the dead should rest in their last bivouac under regimental headstones, while their spirits should be enshrined in the memorials of their homeland. These English memorials will always be with us and will preserve in village, town, or county the memory of their sacrifices, but also the ideals for which they fought. So let's think out how to make our still lovely villages yet more lovely. And thus he encouraged each community to create its own memorial, whether that was a village cross or a wall plaque, or a sculpture, or a building, or maybe just an inscription. Here is Cobham's. This is Herbert's home village in Kent, and this is how he, as one of the architects, put his ideas into practice. It's Herbert's own design. He's chosen the end of the village street. He has gone to the laird of the property and found a bit of land in a prominent place and raised it up. It'll be 100 years old this autumn, and somebody cleverly found this picture of it being dedicated by Florence, Lady Darnley. Florence was the wife of Ivo Bligh, whom many will have heard of, the cricketer of Ashes fame. And this ceremony took place on Christmas Eve 1921, and Cobham is planning to do a rededication by today's Lady Darnley later this week. Different settings inspire different designs. Just 3 miles from Cobham is Mepham's village cross. It's placed at a divide in the road which circles the green, where cricket has always been played and where both Ivor Bligh and Herbert would have played themselves. Herbert laid out the hedges and the trees to create the space and added these sarsen stones each side of the entrance. These megaliths had for centuries been used to mark a warrior's grave, and here Herbert has reused them for that same purpose. And again, thanks to a picture postcard collection, we have a picture of a dedication ceremony. And there's something about the body language which reminds me of how important these memorials were at the time. Look at the crowd. Everyone would have known someone lost and here commemorated. I don't have a date for this dedication ceremony, but it must also be close to 100 years. Maybe it was November the 11th. This is Canterbury. Herbert was invited to create a memorial in Canterbury to commemorate all the people of Kent who had died, both at home and overseas. And he chose this piece of garden in a corner of the city wall, beneath the cathedral, and quite close to the county cricket ground. He used a double cross, there was a double cross there, which he had found in Ypres. And behind it, a ruined flint guardhouse in the old city wall, he adapted to a chapel of remembrance. There was damage to this cross in World War II. Another wall close by was hit by a bomb. But as Herbert wrote, the cross, wounded, stood erect. Churchyards, next. Churchyards provide traditional settings, and here Baker's at Etchingham in Sussex is close to Rudyard Kipling's home, and it was Kipling who unveiled it. And to the right, for comparison, here is Lutyens answering the same brief at Busbridge near Godalming, close to Gertrude Jekyll's home. Let's look at some other responses to that article in the Times. John referred to the banker, Alfred Beit. You called him Beat. I'm calling him Beit. It's a bit different. Alfred Beit and his bequest for the Rhodes Memorial. Alfred's brother was Otto, who lived in Tewin in Hertfordshire. Otto suggested a memorial of lasting use to that village, raised a public subscription, and asked Herbert to design it. And here is Tewin's Memorial Village Hall, also 100 years old this autumn. And seen here from the back, the hall has two wings facing forward. The one on the right with the extra chimney is the parish room, and hidden behind the other, a house for the caretaker. I apologize for the umbrella in this view. We did choose the wettest day of the year to visit. But when I lived in South Africa in the 60s, it was a hobby of mine to search out Herbert's houses. And here at Tewin, I was reminded of all the hallmarks: the tall chimney, the dormer window where the roof is hipped, and the main roof hipped as well. And here's an early shot of the interior. Caroline and I were shown around by a member of its committee, and it's clear this hall is still the centre of village life, lovingly looked after. And during lockdown, it received a new boiler, insulation, and even a sprung floor. And it's all laid out to play badminton. Here's a view of the front of the hall today, dominated by a pair of yew trees, contemporary companions of memorials. And we saw yew trees in John's shot of Norfolk Cemetery as well. And contemporary with Tewin, Lutyens was adapting a stable to form another village memorial hall, this one in Gerrard's Cross. Here's another comparison. Here the two architects again have added to their beautiful spaces shelters, echoing that point John made of their contributions to the war graves in France and Belgium, because the shelter offers a place for those who come to mourn and to remember, to rest. Hatfields on the left is very tranquil, and the shelter almost lost under a wisteria. even though it's directly opposite a busy railway station and multi-storey car park. The last two examples of Herbert's different concepts are here. This is Blackmore in Hampshire, which was the home of Lord and Lady Selborne, good friends of his. Selborne had been the High Commissioner in South Africa who set up that country's constitution. And among the villagers lost was their son, Bobby Palmer. It's a three-sided cloister with the cross in front, and it's close to the village school and intended as a memorial for future generations. And also Herbert had the concept of the school children would, as it were, play with those who were remembered here. So he's trying to join generations together. So what do you think? Do these examples fill the bill? Do they make a lovely village yet more lovely? I've got a last one for you. Here is Overbury in Worcestershire, where Herbert added this traditional lich gate in the foreground. On your way to church then, as you pass under it and you touch the memorial stone to those who are lost, you are reminded of the freedoms which we enjoy as a result. Rudyard Kipling, we mentioned Kipling already, had supplied the immortal phrases so familiar in Flanders. Their name liveth forevermore, for example. Kipling was also asked to provide an inscription for a memorial in faraway Sault Ste. Marie in Canada in 1924. The words he offered bring us back to the meaning of all these memorials. So I'd like to end with Kipling's words. From little towns in a far land, we came to save our honor and a world of flame. By little towns in a far land, we sleep and trust those things we won to you to keep. Thank you. I'm going to hand you back to John now, I think.
Thank you. Just in case you missed it earlier, the first full biography of Sir Herbert will be published hopefully in the next few weeks, just in time for Christmas stockings. Thank you very much. Robbie, over to you.
Goodness me, wow. I mean, who couldn't be moved by the incredible memorials that you have highlighted, and the complexities that must have gone on behind all of what was done. Both your talks this evening have been incredibly insightful, of course, but also really do hammer home just the challenges that this emerging generation of architects were set in how do you tackle the concept of memorials, and of course, more importantly than their own work, the challenges that they faced in their wider communities. And so thank you very much for not only touching on the interesting architecture and the concepts of what they had to tackle, but also just the way that the wider context really was framed. Just such a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. Now, questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I'm going to kick off because I'm intrigued. The insight that you gave, John, on Baker being given the wonderful opportunity to go on the grand tour of sorts by Rhodes is something I didn't realise at all. And I just wonder how the memorials that he created post-involvement Rhodes, I mean, obviously the ones that you set out with Rhodes are very important and quite clearly influenced by his grand tour, but how do you think his war memorials might have differed had he not had that benefit? Or do you think the context of Blomfield and Lutyens might have pushed him in a certain direction anyway?
Interesting. I think the Rhodes Memorials are very much a group in themselves, and reflect Rhodes's influence on Baker in those early formative years of his practice. I think that Rhodes saw classical architecture as the architecture of empires and wanted to make a connection between the great empires of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and the British Empire, which he was doing everything he could to extend, excuse me, extend as far as he could within his lifetime. And so they reflect very much Rhodes's personality as well as Baker's approach. And he was, you know, despite his wealth, a man of simple tastes. He lived a relatively Spartan existence, and I think that those memorials reflect that. Certainly there are elements of them. Clearly the colonnade or the portico, which continued through Baker's architecture, excuse me, and appeared again and again in India and the Bank of England and so on. But then I think as Baker developed, his architecture became much richer, and he particularly became much more interested in symbols and symbolism. And certainly when you come to Winchester College School Memorial, for example, I mean, it is just encrusted in the symbols of the regiments, the empire, and everything else. So his architecture, by the time he was working for the Imperial War Grave Commission, was much richer, much more interested in symbolism. And actually there was almost a complete turnaround with Lutyens being much more the elemental classicist, and the great controversy being between Lutyens, who offered the simplicity of the war stone, and Baker, who couldn't contemplate a memorial in all of the cemeteries which didn't have the Christian cross within it. And in fact, he developed further memorials for the different religions, but of course Lutyens' war stone solved that issue at a stroke. So they all, you know, it almost turned around, and Baker's work for the Imperial War Graves Commission, I think, and his other memorials of that period were much richer, much more, and much with a lot more symbolism than those early ones had.
I could add a bit, if you like, on symbolism. It reminded me of in India. When they're in India, they want to put some symbols up, just like at Winchester, in the council chamber, in the debating hall that they're building in the 20s. But they need to. They want to have an image which represents each of the Indian states. They're part of the debate. But some of in the way the British understand it, the Indians didn't have a symbol for each state. Well, we'll just have to invent some then. So he got together some friends who were civil servants and said, come on, we need a symbol for all your states. What are they? And put them together and made a sample. And as I understand it, there are bronze plaque about the size of footballs, but as shields over that building. But I haven't been to look.
How amazing. Just continue on that. Sorry, Karen.
And then secondly, you also have South Africa House. If you go into South Africa House, I haven't been there for a long time, but there are, what Herbert was trying to do was create a space that echoed South Africa for South Africans particularly. So again, a lot of symbols will go into that too.
There's just another interesting tale in relation to the Indian Parliament, because the original proposal was that there should be 2 chambers. And then when that was suggested, the Maharajas rebelled and said, no, we require our own chamber. So a 3rd chamber was added. And again, around that, there was a symbol provided for each of the Maharajas. But unfortunately, they weren't actually erected for a further 2 years because they couldn't agree on the pecking order amongst themselves, and eventually had to draw lots.
Amazing. There's a couple of questions coming in. I'm going to just follow on with another one, which sort of builds on what we've been talking. I mean, I think I was certainly struck by the art that was integrated very early on into those early Rhodes sculptures, and actually runs all the way through. But there's also a sensitivity in the way either you've described it, or certainly his work, with its materials, these symbols, the social consideration of giving shelter to these people. I mean, there's a sort of incredible humanity to his work, and whilst the classical may have provided a grand statement and order, there's also a detail that runs through his work. And I just wonder whether you could expand on perhaps where some of those influences may have stemmed from. Science.
No, I think there was a sensitivity. I mean, I think all three principal architects who visited the temporary cemeteries during the First World War to better understand the problem that they were faced with were struck by the scale of the loss. And it's very difficult for us looking back 100 years later to understand just how people perceived the First World War. But there was a huge amount of triumphalism as well. And many of the monuments that were erected after had eagles killing snakes and so on, and really did focus on the Allied victory rather than the loss. I think in Sir Herbert's work, it was very much about the loss. The key theme was to provide settings of peace and tranquility and contemplation rather than being celebratory in almost every case.
Very, very interesting. Michael, do you want to add anything, or on to the next question?
I think.
Yeah, on to the next one. One, I think, very interesting. Question from Andy: did the two men remain friends, or was there professional rivalry over their work in India? No talk.
How long have we got?
Yeah.
They became
13 minutes at least.
They were very good friends, and they maintained the friendship through all the years when Herbert Baker was in South Africa, but it didn't last very long when they finally came to work together in India. And they fell out pretty badly and pretty seriously during the India years. And it became quite bitter, really, by the early 30s. But towards the end of their lives, in the latter part of the 1930s, I think it's fair to say Sir Herbert made the first move at reconciliation, supporting Sir Edwin Lutyens' presidency of the Royal Academy. And from that point onwards, they spent time together and would often meet at the Athenaeum and the RIBA and the Royal Academy. So they were reconciled by the very end.
And that was backed up by Charles Wheeler. Charles Wheeler, the sculptor, worked for both of them. And Charles Wheeler's autobiography is probably not the right word for it, but his book of his life, he does talk them about them making up at the end, though not everybody agreed that they had.
That's fascinating, and as you say, controversial as well. I feel it's often a point that seems to unnecessarily divide these two, the friendship or otherwise. They were two phenomenal architects. Do either of you have an opinion on what Mr. Modi is proposing to?
Well, at least the original buildings aren't being tampered with, as far as I know. I mean, they're not being knocked down to make way for him. Other things are being crowded on, and Lutyens is losing. The vista was very important to Lutyens, and that's certainly being affected. But at least the buildings seem to be surviving. Am I right?
Yeah,
Yes.
I believe so. I mean, I've got mixed views. I think the caliber of what's being proposed, I think, will stand in stark contrast to the work of Baker and Lutyens. However, if the suggestion that perhaps the secretariats become museum buildings, for example, I think that could be a real positive, because the interiors of those buildings are very, very rarely seen. They're absolutely stunning. And so if it did mean that the public could experience them, I think that would be a real positive.
Thank you for that.
When I was in Delhi in the 90s, I think it was, I was really surprised walking around the Secretariat buildings to see a wooden bench, an ordinary garden wooden bench, sitting in the open underneath one of those colonnades. And I looked at that and I thought, Herbert designed that. It must have been there ever since, and nobody's taken it away. It was still sitting there. I'd be really surprised it's still there now, but there it was.
I say bringing new life is so important. Thank you. You dealt with that very well. Another question: do you wish to say anything about Baker's private graves and memorials?
Private graves memorials. He did various other memorials we haven't talked about. W.G. Grace Gates going into Lords comes to mind. There are, since we're going to Cobham, we started off in Cobham. I started off in Cobham. There are 3 simple gravestones he did in Cobham churchyard. One to the same Ivo Bligh, one to Herbert did for his elder brother Henry Edmeades Baker, normally known as Harry, and a third one was to the gardener, Robert Jones, gardener to Herbert's father, I think, but certainly to Herbert, was, you know, a solid man of the earth. I can't remember the words he put up there, but he did a beautiful gravestone for his gardener.
Well, there are many of them, in addition to the major ones that we've been able to show a little of today. My particular favourite is the gravestone he designed for his friend John Buchan, which is in Elsfield churchyard, and just a very simple stone horizontal disc with an inscription around the edge, and John Buchan's name and dates on top. Very, very simple, restrained, and elegant.
How fascinating. Good. Well, unless there are any other questions I'm about to say, anyone else who wants to add anything quickly? Nope. Right. Well, I mean, you have brought together a vast amount of work that Baker's done, but with such great cohesion. Thank you for clearly the huge amount of time and effort that you've put into this evening's talk, and for the insight that you've provided. I have really enjoyed it, and I know that if the attendees here were in person, there would be resounding applause. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you for joining us this evening.